Okay, so we are live. 1 second. And also record to cloud. All right, we're recording on cloud too. Okay, over to you, Shudipto. Thank you so much.
All right, hello and welcome to the Open Grand Finals of Nepal Australs 2022 now. Congratulations to both teams for making it thus far in what has been an extremely tough tournament. I'll be your chair for this round. My name is Shudipto. I have no preferred pronouns. I have alongside me a fantastic judging panel who I will now invite to introduce themselves, offer a preferred pronoun if they have one, starting with Anum.
Hi, Anum here. She or they is fine. Congratulations on being here and good luck for the match.
Hi, Banun here. No preference. All the best to both teams.
Kia ora, Daniel, he or they. Looking forward to it.
Bryce.
Pranav, he, him, all the best to both teams.
Hi, this is Uphie, he, they. Good luck, everyone.
Zach, no preference. Best of luck to both teams.
I think that's it for the judging panel. Now for the teams themselves. Starting with the side affirmative, which is a team Macquarie 1 with Brendan, Leah, and Udai.
Hey, I'm Brendan. I'll be speaking first on the fly. Her preferred pronouns are he, him. Leah is speaking second. Her preferred pronouns are she, they. And third speaker is Udai.
Thank you. That's it for side half. And now for the side neg, team Ateneo 1 with David, Mikko, and Tobi.
Hi, David speaking first, no pronoun preference.
The quiet comprehending of the ending of it all.
Also, I don't think our music doesn't dance is confirming to you. So there it is Mikko, obviously second
that funny feeling. That funny feeling.
Third, Tobi, no preference, speaking third.
Right. That's it for the round of introductions. So just a bit of housekeeping before we proceed. I will be timing you. I'll drop the 6 and 8 minute markers in the chat, but do maintain your own timers. And so then on the motion that in countries with a history of ethnic tensions, we would embrace cultural appropriation, may we have the first affirmative to kick off this debate. Hear, hear.
Great. Can I be heard?
Yep.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay. I am going to start in 3, 2, 1. Paul Gauguin was a bad person and a great artist. He was a painter and he lived in Polynesia and he painted some incredible work, a mixture of European and Polynesian styles. And if he had tried to leave Tahiti and go back to Europe and paint only European subjects or in a European style, something which we think is itself an inherently vague and contradictory goal, he would still carry those islands with him and they would still influence the way that he painted, because that is how human beings are. We integrate, we borrow, we assimilate, we iterate, indeed, we appropriate. And the claim from Macquarie is that is not only fundamental to being human, but is the best chance for an easing of racial tension within these nations. Firstly, Macquarie will make 2 arguments. Firstly, on why we should embrace cultural appropriation in general, and secondly, why we should embrace cultural appropriation in these contexts and why it reduces the risk of conflict. Firstly, though, an argument in setup. The first thing we'd note is we think cultural appropriation is the appropriation and reappropriation of different cultural ideas and forms. And that means mixing and matching. And sometimes, of course, we are fully happy to defend context where that mixing and matching occurs with a significant power asymmetry, right? So we think that means people incorporating different foods from other cultures and traditions, people incorporating different religious and political ideas, people incorporating different artistic ideas. And the second thing we'd note and set up is you might have some kind of preconceptions about how cultural appropriation is bad and there's a bad word or that we shouldn't do it. But we would make, and I guess the kind of canonical example here, right, is the kind of white dude wearing the dreadlocks, and that scene is something that's quite cringy. We would note, firstly, that's an incredibly small subset of the entirety of cultural appropriation as it exists. But secondly, our claim in this debate is the problem is not that a guy chose to wear his hair in a particular way, but rather that him wearing his hair and getting away with it and not being troubled by police, for example, is an indicator of racial inequity when a black person who wears a similar hairstyle could not. So on to the first argument here, which is why cultural appropriation should be embraced under every circumstance. And the observation here is, think panel of your own cultures. Do you think they founded and they worked and they came up in total isolation from other cultures? Do you think it is likely that what you really value or the forms of artistic expression you value were only formed by one group of people who had a specific form of cultural expression and never interacted or never engaged with other people? I think you would probably agree that all of the art that you care about comes from a mixture of different traditions and different ideas. And it's wrong to try and separate them or push them apart, and you'll only end up with worse art. That's why, for example, many of the dishes most commonly enjoyed today often didn't exist hundreds of years ago, because they involve things like tomatoes and potatoes, which were only found during the European colonization of the World War, of course, of the New World, obviously presuming they're the perspective of those Europeans. And importantly, now we get and gain access to a huge variety of different foods. People can mix and match different things. And that's a broad microcosm for how cultures ought to behave in general. We think cultures ought to evolve and develop with time, because the role of culture is to enrich people's lives, and people change all the time. Their preferences and their circumstances changes. And so culture should be dynamic and ever changing. The second thing we point out here is the mixing of cultural ideas is really good, because it's like really hard to reinvent a whole new different art form from scratch. It's better to take or build upon what someone else has done, or see the different possible connections that could arise if you took one person's style of artwork and mixed it with your own and built it in a new and different way. And the final thing we point out is we just think that a world without cultural appropriation is, if a world that's even kind of really possible in the absolute sense, would be a world which is genuinely quite bad. Like if we tried to not embrace it, it would be a world where we didn't have things like jazz, right? Which is obviously a black musical tradition, was very influenced by more whiter forms like ragtime and marching music. It would be a world without rock and roll. It would be a world with all those things. All of those things came from people in a time of deep racial tension, like 1920s America, culturally appropriating and mixing and matching their own cultures. It would be a world that would be far worse. And that world is a world that negative has to defend, because they have to defend cultures and groups trying to walk away and not embrace each other's culture and not embrace the act of appropriation. And we think like the world they have to defend is a world where groups, individuals more broadly, feel that it's impolite or incorrect, or there's a broad norm around not engaging with other cultures or not trying to be seen or wanting to be accused of appropriation of other cultures. And that we think reckon has three impacts. The first impact is that in the markets for cultural production become dominated by the majority group, because our claim here is a way for minority cultures to persist throughout time, and the way for them not to be quashed or squashed is for them to integrate themselves more broadly into the majority culture so that they can live on. But if there's very little integration, minority cultures minority representation, and the representation of minority culture is much lower. Secondly, though, we think that groups in general have less understanding of other groups because they don't engage in their art, they don't engage in their culture, they don't hear the stories that matter to them. And thirdly, we think there's less individual choice on the part of individuals, because you don't choose the culture that you're raised in, and you might find that aspects of another culture appeal to you, but you find it's much harder for you to access that other culture in a world we don't embrace that kind of collectively embrace this kind of appropriation. And fourthly, we think it furthers narrative around essentialism that says X cultural group has certain immutable cultural traits that cannot be changed or played with, and that promotes difference between groups and encourages groups, individuals to think of themselves as fundamentally different and not in any way capable of coming to some kind of accommodation or sharing in some kind of meaning. all of the impact of that argument is that we just have a world that is poorer in these countries, a world where the cultural life is worse, a world where people do not have access to the full range of cultures that might exist within their borders, and that is a world that we ought to oppose. But secondly, why do we think that engaging in this act of cultural appropriation, messy at times though it can be, is a really good way to reduce conflict? And the first observation we make of this argument is there's kind of like a spectrum of conflict here. Obviously, there's kind of maybe a racialized national politics and generic racial tension. And then obviously at the more extreme end, there's things like outright violence, etc. The reason why we think there's going to be more, or it's more likely for there to be culture under the side of the world that side negative has to defend is for three reasons. We think firstly, for the reasons I gave earlier, there's much more likely to be otherization and siloization between groups. And you view, when other groups engage with your culture, you view them as invading your culture. And likewise, vice versa, you don't feel like you want to invade, you feel like every interaction is a possible provocation, or likely provocation. But secondly, we point out that now your group's cultural production is in direct competition with other groups' form of cultural production, right? Because what might previously have been a melting pot where creators and cultural consumers could mix and match their diet, right? Instead, you have to kind of like pick one group or pick one style and choose it, and usually it's the style that you grew up with, etc. That encourages really zero-sum thinking about the way in which people engage in the market for cultural production. It, for example, influences the kind of TV they watch. It means that every time another group's TV show or form of culture does well, it's a loss for your group, and they can't ever be combined in interesting ways. And finally, we think it's much harder to bring about a national identity and culture that is more inclusive, because we think the best forms of national identity and culture are one that speak to the variety of different cultural experiences in that state. A really good example here for our side is Hamilton, right, which took white traditions and a predominantly white history and mixed it, right, with the kind of more contemporary Black experience of hip hop, and created new and very interesting type of music that people and kind of cultural experience, and people from all different cultures from an increasingly multiracial America could look at that type of culture and see themselves as part of America, which means we unify the nation far better. Obviously, conflict is far less likely on our side, and conflict at the extreme end costs lives. Think about South Africa and Nigeria and the way that different ethnic groups racialize politics and prioritize their own group over the good of the collective. But obviously, nationalized politics generally promotes deadlock and makes it harder for people to push back then. I guarantee you, all of the arguments from negative about why will be about why it's hard to do cultural appropriation well, but we would claim to all of human history, where human beings have interacted with other cultures, interacted with other cultures well, and why the trend there is overwhelmingly positive. For those reasons, Macquarie could not be prouder to stand in proposition.
I thank the first affirmative for that fine speech. May we now have the first neg to kick off the neg case.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yep, audible and visible.
Okay, nice. I feel like roast beef under this lamp, but it's better than like looking like a ghost in my own room. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The heart of cultural appropriation has and always will be violence. What is the likely counterfactual? Insofar as the goal of cultural appropriation on AF is to create a unified identity, there are a host of other narratives that are likely to succeed in lieu. First, a national identity centered around multiculturalism and diversity. Note that this is always exclusive from appropriation, which attempts to merge different cultures by force and allow them to take from each other's elements, whereas multiculturalism allows them to remain distinct from one another and has some form of negotiation. Good examples of this look like Indonesia, Canada, and so on. Secondly, even absent cultural narratives, there are many other features you can construct a national identity around, e.g. natural landscapes, shared pre-colonial history prior to artificial division, and third, shared interests for the future of the nation, like in Rwanda, Singapore, and many other multi-ethnic states that pursued economic development. Thirdly, not only do we think we are better at achieving national unity, we will further prove that tensions escalate when using cultural appropriation. Briefly, why are these likely counterfactuals? A country with ethnic tensions likely has negative perceptions of each other's cultures, which manifests in flawed cultural appropriation, which we will argue later. And in our side, we're willing to accept that there may be a greater degree of cultural separation, so efforts are focused on common interests to build common institutions. Before I move on to my arguments, I have two responses. Their first response is towards this broad principled appeal to having done this before. First, I want to note that experiencing multiculturalism and the benefits of multiculturalism is not the same as the fruits of cultural theft. The key distinction of appropriation is that it is done without the consent of the subjugated. And it is easy enough to imagine that even if we did not steal jazz music from African Americans, and if Britain did not steal curry from Indian colonization, we may indeed still listen to jazz music and eat curry, but the difference is that the proprietorship is in the hands of the minority rather than the majority who claims now to own it. Secondly, even if this was true, then who cares? Like, I am willing to give up tomatoes and potatoes if it means that this colonization and violence did not happen. It is brave to claim that all of human history has been overwhelmingly positive when it is built on the suffering, the plunder of these individuals whom have had their sacred rights taken away, who had the objective of their entire lives basically desecrated by these people. We don't think this is worth it, and their appeal to just things are good now is simply ignorant and tone deaf to the experience of suffering and oppression that people had in the past that was egged on by this cultural appropriation. The second response is towards some form of integration that reduces violence. The first point I'd like to make is just, it is unclear what the mechanistic link is. It is not clear that cultural appropriation leads to cultural integration. There's a large evidential gap there. And what we suggest is that despite appropriating it, they still remain evidentially distinct for the reason, just look at the example of how African-American rap is constantly culturally appropriated, despite the fact that they are seen and in fact explained to be as thuggish through that rap. In many cases, cultural appropriation exacerbates the differentiation of cultures that may exist in such a situation. But secondly, this is contradictory to your later point of being seen as an invasion, since if this is seen as an attempt to assimilate and change your native culture as a majority, then we think people are more likely to be defensive on AF than on neg, because it is seen as changing the constructs of the majority culture rather than remaining distinct as a minority culture. These two rebuttals prove, they flip the mechanisms, which means that the impacts are flipped totally towards our side, which is why affirmative already is losing this debate, even just from response alone. Argument one, in the vast majority of cases, appropriation is likely to be done in horrible ways that only lead to further division. Note that their preemption is just, oh, it's good, there are some good examples. If we illustrate that you can't reach those good examples, if the particular formulation of the appropriation leads to worse forms, then we already win. That preemption doesn't make sense. Appropriation is likely to be done in ways that raise tensions on AF for three reasons. First, this is likely to be highly offensive to the cultures from whom these are taken from. These are people who destroyed your cultural symbols, who shamed you for expressing and using these cultures. And the outrage comes from the hypocrisy of the double standard where you are made fun of, but they win awards standing on the bedrock of your subjugation and standing on the bedrock of the slurs that you use. Secondly, when the same group makes use of your culture, there is a feeling that they were not celebrated but stolen, which is why there are strong sentiments of anger towards the British for brandishing artifacts stolen from regions they colonized. They have an incentive to take credit for this. After a group appropriates its culture, after a sufficient period of time, people end up believing that the appropriating culture is the original creator of this culture, which itself feels like a deep and grave theft of violence on these individuals. But moreover, there are also market incentives to worsen thuggish stereotypes of these minority cultures. They drive a race to the bottom where market incentives encourage appropriations like hip-hop and blaxploitation films that actively seek out the most stereotypical depictions of minority individuals to create a differentiated and unique product. And third and last reason for why this will be done badly is because these are sacred. Many of these sacred cultures are exclusive by nature because they are of immense spiritual and religious significance and often require people from that group to practice them exclusively, otherwise they are offensive to their gods and to their deities. The massive power imbalance between ethnic groups, which means that the majority is likely to highlight the cultures of the others in ways that favor them, means that things are likely to get worse. They may say this happens on our side. The power imbalance may still exist. The problem why it isn't as prevalent is because, one, on our side, there is no claim to legitimacy. We don't legitimize cultural appropriation as a strategy, and their interpretation of other cultures are never given national weight. E.g., the widespread adoption of Filipino only came from the tokenistic inclusion of other languages despite being predominantly Tagalog in shape and form, exclusionary to all other native and indigenous languages. And secondly, the deprioritization of individual ethnic cultures with a broader focus on the construction of a national identity means that they have far less legitimacy, which means they're forced to seek out other ways. Thirdly, even if they may try to force their culture on the nation, or they may try to force some multiculturalism on the nation, it's better that they do it without demonizing the cultures of minority groups, because if they still want legitimacy, the way that they are forced to do that without appropriation is by allowing some negotiation, by allowing members of these groups in the state as representatives to mean that there's some form of negotiation and informed consent, which means that the representation itself is better. But the third and last reason for why appropriation happens is because these are historically feuding cultures, and the only aspects which can be safely appropriated are likely the ones that are mildest and least representative of that culture. What happens as a result of this appropriation? One, outright violence. In the instances where this culture is deeply held, there will be an attempt to defend. The exclusive use of these artifacts in that appropriation will be seen as theft. Secondly, in more moderate instances, the resurgence of discrimination, particularly against smaller groups which are now represented by a caricaturized version of their culture. Rap and hip-hop, despite their appropriation and integration in American culture, have not in fact reduced the actual police brutality faced by people on the ground, but have instead exacerbated ideas of the hood hood of Black people as thuggish and violent. And thirdly, further ethnic polarization, as now people feel forced to be tied to their in-group and the defense of that specific interpretation of that culture, which means it's harder to get inter-ethnic cooperation, legal reform, and trust in state institutions. Even without the counterfactual, we already prove why things get so much worse. But why is our counterfactual better? One, our counterfactual illustrates that without the appropriation majorities used to construct popular culture, there is still a need to artifice multiculturalism to reduce ethnic tensions. Then it must be done through the participative representation of these people, which means that people are far less likely to be in tension over this. Secondly, even if they don't like each other, their common incentives are aligned so long as aspects of their identity that are in tension with each other can be overlooked, which means that they're able to prioritize other things. And thirdly, our counterfactual illustrates that without the appropriation, we free up minorities to take advantage of their culture instead of losing a competitive market advantage to the dominant culture. You're the one stealing away ownership, not us. Second argument, why even with pure intentions, cultural appropriation prevents reconciliation. This argument takes them at their best. Even if it is just things that are vaguely good, it is unclear why you could create a meaningful connection between cultures that could not be achieved without appropriation. But moreover, we argue that you caricaturize these groups. Once you create a depiction of these model minorities, any deviation from that positive depiction generates resentment and misunderstanding analogous to the model minority effects on Asian Americans who have disproportionately high levels of suicidal ideation over any other ethnic group in America. This is why African Americans are depicted as jazzing, comedic entertainers with vaudeville representations and caricatures, and any other African American that did not in that time was treated like dirt. The problem, however, and the difference between affirmative and negative is that it gives a perception of acceptance. Obviously, the negating team must still contend with the context of discrimination, we agree, but what we claim is that the cultural lie of unity does more harm without solving underlying problems, because it's easier to take away legislation that protects against discrimination because the guise of acceptance means that you feel less of a political push to fix things, and it's easier to take away the rights cultural minorities demand, like land rights, like cultural rights, like religious rights. It is on all these bases that AF defends violence, and it is why does the world neg can never stand for. Negate.
I thank the speaker for that fine speech. May we now have the second AF to extend the affirmative case further.
Just 1 moment to set up. Okay, hi, am I audible?
Yep.
Thank you. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. In order to credit the alternative offered to you by the negative team in this debate, you must believe that culture is a series of decisions that happen in a court of law that people can actively be represented in and that they can always be present at the table at to consent. The problem with their case was that their alternative and the things that it relied upon to be a positive one were things that were incredibly unlikely to happen in this country that had deep ethnic tensions. And also, though, that it relied on a characterization on culture that was simply not true, that it was something that humanity had control over, that it wasn't something that happened from a process of minuscule individual daily decisions made by billions or millions or hundreds of thousands of people in a country, a city, or a town. So, what comparative does this debate actually have? So we told you that cultural appropriation is likely to be good and should definitely continue. We told you that sharing and mixing aspects from different cultures not only reduces conflict, but is what gives us the richness of human culture that we should vote for in this debate. What did they respond to you with? Firstly, they responded with a definition that appropriation is only appropriation when done without consent, and that this proprietorship was something worth defending on their side. We told you, though, that consent was less likely to happen on their side of the house. And so if the harm that you felt as somebody from a minority culture when you saw a similar dress to one that your mother wore historically being worn to an American prom, if the main harm that came from that was that you weren't able to consent, you actually lost that more in a world where your country had not embraced cultural appropriation. Because my speech will tell you a set of reasons why cultural appropriation, when it is embraced, increases opportunity for people to have conversations and for people to consent. But we also told you that when we embrace cultural appropriation, the group of people who that culture belongs to have now got active incentives to consent and participate actively, where in the other world, where you don't embrace it, where you do it in sneaky ways that people are too ashamed of to make a public and democratic process, then they have absolutely no way to get involved and have a voice in that process. So they can argue for proprietorship, but they need a mechanism in which they can provide it. They then told you, look, violence is at the heart of appropriation, and therefore, in order to increase a united identity, we should instead opt for things like multiculturalism and diversity that would happen instead. And they told you a couple of things about why this happens in a good way. They told you, firstly, there's a need for us to reduce ethnic tensions and that everybody has common incentives. First response is that it's unclear why this need to reduce ethnic tensions and why this common incentives for people to have a peaceful nation wouldn't equally apply to the process of embracing cultural appropriation that we stand for on our side of the house. But secondly, just because the idea of violence being at the heart of this cultural appropriation was their main harm, in fact, the best way to escape that was to increase the circumstances of cultural appropriation so much that now the majority of them were not the painful ones that these ethnic groups had memories of for hundreds of years ago, but rather good ones that were happening in a context in which humanity was far more evolved. We told you that this was an incredibly good process that should continue because it's going to prevent conflicts. We told you that, firstly, there is a few reasons when you do not actively embrace cultural appropriation that decent actors do not get involved, and it only happens in the very extreme set of circumstances where people feel immune to social pressure. So, for example, people feel that they cannot do cultural appropriation in these contexts right now because they believe it is immoral and incorrect. That means a couple of things. It means, firstly, that markets favor the dominant group and they cannot therefore make viable products that are available to be purchased by a large consumer base if they are from a minority culture, because you cannot buy something due to the active social disincentive that inherently devalues that product. I cannot buy an Indigenous purse with a dot painting on it and wear it every day as a white woman in Australia without being ridiculed. And that meant something really bad. It meant, firstly, that groups had less understanding and appreciation for the history of other groups. When you remove this financial incentive to share culture, you remove the fact that history was likely to be protected. For example, I was taught Durga at school, which is a local Indigenous language that was only taught to me because we had access to real Indigenous leaders so that they could not be accused of cultural appropriation when teaching it to us. But we were the only school in Australia who was taught this language. If, however, the dictionary that they developed was a product that was viable to the entire market of school teachers, was something that wouldn't be culturally appropriating to teach from a white perspective, then it meant that that language wouldn't have died, which it now has. None of us can speak that language in our daily lives, and the Indigenous community who revived that language have received absolutely no financial compensation for doing so, and it is being forgotten all over again because of the active incentives for good actors in this debate not to engage with the work that was done there. But we also told you that this brings owners into the limelight in a respected manner when you embrace cultural appropriation, because there are all those incentives they told you about to reduce ethnic tensions, and there are also a whole bunch of trends we can point to in the status quo where good actors, the type of people who are affected by this norm, don't get involved in cultural appropriation. So now when they don't get punished for being involved in cultural appropriation, it means that they have an active incentive incentives to achieve things like authenticity. So when they told you that there's going to be a race to the bottom to have the most stereotypical example of a culture to win out the market, that didn't make much sense, because the people we expand the market to in this debate are people who care about other people's perceptions of them, right? Which means that they only want to do things that are seen as acceptable and authentic, which means that they have an incentive to A, buy products from actual creators who belong to that minority group, or B, when they are appropriating, allow people from that minority group to consent or to comment on it. For example, in forums such as Twitter, when you wear a dress to your prom that is Indigenous or Chinese, that you don't necessarily block that from being viewed by anyone from a minority so that they cannot comment and say, wow, I love the way that you look in that dress and I love the way that my history is being showcased. We told you though that conflict was going to be much worse on this side of the house, and that was important because they told you a couple of really weird pushes to try to capture our same benefits. Firstly, that you can develop a national identity around things like landmarks. Just question the logic of this. Like, Ayers Rock in Australia has two incredibly different narratives about that landmark that is incredibly divisive, and the reason those narratives have not been resolved with each other is because of the multicultural and segregated communities that we live in Australia, in which we do not listen to the opinions of people who are Indigenous living at Ayers Rock, and therefore the knowledge about that landmark is controlled by the dominant and hegemonic group. So how was that national identity likely to be crafted by the groups they cared about on this side of the house? They then told you that ethnic tensions get worse when you have negative perceptions and flawed appropriation. We told you though that flawed appropriation and negative perceptions are more likely on their side of the house because you have less opportunity for interaction between groups, because history gets lost and is no longer accessible to be done in an accurate way, and because minority voices don't have market incentives to be involved in that conversation. They then told you that, look, now there's a race, an incentive to take credit, so people believe that it happened from you. We would argue that in a world where you embrace cultural appropriation, credit would no longer be the incredibly harmful concept that it is. There is no value to be gained as a white person stealing something from a minority culture, because cultural appropriation was the norm on this side of the house. Finally, to conclude this speech, anything you care about from the negative team is all things that are caused by racism rather than cultural appropriation. And in a world where our cultures were further integrated and further mixed through this conversation, I tell you in my speech, you would have had less racism and you would be less likely to lock out conversations that could have prevented these very harmful characterizations.
I thank the second F for that fine speech. May we now have the second neg to further the neg case.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
You are audible, but very distant.
Trying to fix that. Is that better?
Yeah, this is better.
All right, wonderful. Okay, I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Unity, when in the hands of the powerful, is a thinly veiled guise for domination and theft. I will later extend and explain why some degree of cultural separation, where we don't get the integration and unity affirmative wants, is a far better comparative than lying and saying it exists already on affirmative. But I will first question that this unity occurs to begin with, because I want to note the nature of cultural appropriation that they do not care about. The first thing is, embracing it does not mean that you're going to do it any better, because one, this assumes a relatively equal power balance between these two cultures. When we clearly explain that in many instances of ethnic tension, there are some cultures that are far more powerful than others. So their main mechanism of, you will be punished for it. They will force you to ensure that you make sure you get credit and get from the original creators, especially when a lot of their examples are in America and not actually places where there's intense ethnic tension. Prove that it's unlikely this would have occurred to begin with. And that means a couple of things for cultural appropriation. The first is that it's done without consent, which not only means it's less authentic, it also means there's no understanding anything beyond this culture. It is often the most the most basic, the most on the surface notions of these cultures, that therefore means their benefit of understanding this culture better, of understanding the people behind this culture, is incredibly unlikely. Like, I genuinely don't think white women doing yoga incredibly more often has made them any more knowledgeable about Hindu gods and the nature of the Hindu religion. But secondly, is that it's selective interaction, i.e., you only pick and choose the parts of the culture you like in order to appropriate, and therefore you don't have to understand the parts that you don't like so much. Especially in a context where there's intense ethnic tension, you're unlikely to pick the challenging portions of it or the parts that would actually decrease the capacity for discrimination in these instances. Why is this an important claim to make in this debate? The claim from affirmative is that the appropriating culture gets more accepting. What we claim is that the appropriated culture is more likely to be angry, more likely to be offended. What I have just proven is that there's very limited change for the appropriating culture, and therefore they don't become any more understanding, nor do they prove why they are a much better actor than the appropriated culture, and refuse to respond to David in that instance. There are many reasons still standing as to why the appropriated culture is not likely to appreciate this. One, because it's likely to be seen as theft, precisely because there's an attempt to try and take credit for it for all the reasons second affirmative gives. Credit isn't important. We're sharing this culture. But if the other people in other nations look and see that the people most responsible for this culture, because they've expanded the market, as first affirmative says, they're the ones making all the production of this culture, then it's therefore stolen. They're not likely to appreciate that. But secondly, it's just the history that these countries have. Why is it that you killed my people? Why is it you engage in intense ethnic violence, but still choose to try and take parts of my culture? It's unlikely that that builds understanding, if not an immense amount of hatred, because of the hypocrisy that these kinds of majority cultures are able to celebrate as a consequence. So if you believe these two claims, they have to somehow save the fact that the appropriating culture gains any meaningful cultural discourse or interaction, because this is not the same as other kinds of cultural discourse or interaction. This is not Paul Gauguin trying to make beautiful paintings. It is unlikely that that is the nature of the cultural appropriation that exists here, and therefore you ought prefer the issue of whether or not the offending, or rather the appropriated culture, is more likely to be angered. But what I want to note is that a degree of cultural separation in our worst case is still better. The first thing I want to note, however, is that there are many alternative methods to be able to build nationalism. They just say, well, it's both sides of the house being able to do it. The first thing I want to note is that for things like cultural nationalism, it is a lot easier, again, to pick and choose which parts are most acceptable to you, rather than other forms of being able to build a nationalism that are more likely to ensure you can coalesce on similar incentives. But here's why, even if that counterfactual wasn't true, why is a degree of cultural separation, where there is some degree of tension, where they don't have cultural appropriation, still better? First, they want to engage with the material on markets. They say, well, when you allow yourself to be subjugated by the majority culture, the market expands, and therefore you benefit. When a wealthier culture is now responsible for the production and distribution of that culture, I don't know why the original culture benefits any more meaningfully, because they don't explain how you can still compete in this market where the larger culture is likely to outcompete you on a resource basis, of a popularity and reputation basis, and therefore the original minority culture in which that resided was unlikely to meaningfully gain that benefit. To which they say, well, at least the market exists. I want to note first that this trade-off of a smaller market with a greater amount of control for these minority cultures is much better than a bigger market with the inability for them to survive. But I want to note that this market is still likely to exist, precisely because this is a culture that this minority group, at least domestically, is going to likely ensure they can take cultural products from, ensure they can exchange, probably not to the same extent, but to the extent that it has survived, precisely because it has survived years of ethnic tension. And what I'd like to note about this argument is that it's the only one that is actually going to be beneficial for this kind of minority culture. Secondly, what is the likely vision of the state? Because again, culture is honestly the easiest thing to try and say that you can give a group of people. We accept parts of you. We accept parts of you that are just actions, that are just habits, but don't really want to engage with the hard parts of you, the parts of you that might demand structural change, the parts of you that we don't like, the parts of you that have values and cultures that we don't understand. Why is this very harmful? And I'd like to note that the likely comparative, even if it came to separation of cultural spaces, limited cultural understanding and action, I would say this kind of separation that probably offers the greater amount of devolution to these kinds of states, a greater amount of the separation of powers, a greater amount of admitting these are just separate cultures and therefore unlikely to want to interact with one another and therefore divide, is still better in that instance for three reasons. The first is that you remove the ability to correct discrimination in legislation, because you can say we already accept them. We do all these cultural habits. We live life just like they do. And therefore, it is unclear why things like affirmative action, things like correcting for any kinds of discrimination are acts of racial discrimination rather than just individualized instances of hatred, of violence, of anger. And in these instances, it's much more difficult to correct these kinds of legislations as well. But the second thing I'd want to note is that even if you couldn't get that legislation to begin with, at least you limit the likelihood of those kinds of interactions, precisely because you are not so dependent on this majority culture, because you have the same shared cultural spaces, because you rely on them for the production of your culture, and therefore the instances in which there is discrimination that occurs diminishes as well. So in both regards, we win that. But secondly, is that you justify the theft in order to ensure unity, precisely because why does this indigenous group of people have any more right to their land than I do? Because I also want to be able to experience that culture and land. And that extends to many things: land, cultural sites, the ability to have a lot of tangible things that are connected to culture as reminders of that culture are more likely to be stolen, appropriated, and taken away from the dominating culture in order to, and justified in the sense that they can say, we have the same culture, I'm just appropriating it. You have no right to that as much as I do. In these instances, it is unclear why the alternative were some degree of separation, where they would have likely kept that, is any worse. But thirdly, is that at the very least, people within these cultures, despite having a degree of ethnic tensions, can still experience cultures in ways that are important to them. And I agree, culture is arbitrary, but it's also tailored and fit to specific groups of people in ways that they know best. When it is instead dependent on these larger markets constructed by cultures that have hated you for so long, that you now have to access your religion, your own culture, it is more likely you feel a sense of alienation from the people around you, and an alienation from the culture that you so wanted to be able to respect. But lastly, anyone who deviates from the notion of African Americans as comedians, jazz singers, entertainers is now subjugated as dirt. It is the model minority argument that says you have to be a specific way, the parts that we like, and if you are not, we will continue to discriminate and oppress you. I am very, very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for that fine speech. May we now have the third half.
Cool. Am I visible and audible to everyone?
Yep.
Hello?
Oh, I said, yeah, you're audible and visible.
Excellent. When cultures run into each other, they may either merge and mix, as we propose, or they may fight for dominance. And we would suggest that that is far, far worse, which is why you must side with affirmative in this debate. Three things in this speech then. Firstly, what is the comparative and counterfactual in this debate? What must each side defend? Secondly, why will it be done well? And thirdly, why is it that, we just think in general, there are a range of benefits to be achieved here. So firstly, let's address the counterfactual. I really want to point out here how heavily Neg relies on just a really insane burden push here in order to make their arguments. Because they want to tell us things like, well, you have to defend colonialism and the violent taking of artifacts and destruction of attributes of our culture and the theft and violence that goes along with it. While on our side, we would just defend like multiculturalism, which is pretty good. But that's obviously not the burden in this debate for a couple of reasons. Firstly, this debate occurs prospectively. It's about should embrace, not in the past, which means that all of the harms they identify are things that have already happened. But secondly, colonialism and exploitation and theft, etc., are obviously things that have causes outside of this norm that are far stronger. For example, economic benefits to colonizing other countries, things like religious forces to spread your religion and, like convert other people, things like viewing other cultures as inferior and so on, which we would suggest is far more likely on their side. So it's unclear that that is something that they can push onto us. So the worst claims that they want us to defend are immediately out there. But secondly, they obviously don't get to defend multiculturalism because they have no explanations to how multiculturalism arises on their side. Like, listen to the analysis in that first negative speech. There's a lot of talking about consent and negotiation to arrive at multiculturalism, but that's just word salad, right? Like, cultures don't have lawyers that represent them and negotiate and consent on their behalf. They're just represented by large groups of people who are often heterogeneous, who often disagree on when they would like those cultures to interact or how they would like those cultures to interact. So how is it that this negotiation occurs? How is it that you can have consentful sharing in their world but not in our world? It was laughable. Obviously, you could not. There was no analysis as to how that occurred. But we point out in first affirmative, preemptively to no response, that it wouldn't occur for the reason that this norm, where you see embracing other cultures and appropriating as bad, as impolite, as wrong, where you don't mix, where you don't associate, is one where cultures will siloize, where they will explicitly attempt not to associate with other cultures, because when you view cultural appropriation as bad, you also view keeping the purity of your culture intact and not sharing it as good, which is why you would never get to the point of negotiation. They never explained why that was the case. Third negative has a lot of work to do. But they then try and say that there'd be a lot of other unifying factors like landscapes and post-colonial resistance. Firstly, very ironic of David to appropriate Venu's speech from that world semi-final. But secondly, there are obviously a range of responses to this. Firstly, in often cases, countries did not have things like post-colonial resistance or like landscapes. Secondly, often many groups were not part of that post-colonial resistance. Many groups collaborated with oppressors. Many groups fought against each other. It's unclear why this is a particularly unifying force. Thirdly, history fades, right? Like maybe that works in the aftermath of independence, but why would that work 50 years down the line or 100 years down the line when you never then merge afterwards, when you never share cultures, when you can never develop a national identity that is anything more than something occurred 100 years ago? There was insufficient analysis here. And lastly, like landscapes, really, that is all you have? But like, oh, we'll have like put a lake in our national anthem or something and everyone will get together. This was laughably insufficient here. What is it that side negative must then defend? Firstly, cultures siloizing against each other to defend their purity. Things like cultures not wanting to view each other. And we explain a range of harms here. One, when cultures cannot mix, they necessarily come into competition because there's limited space within, the media and within like society in general for cultures to exist. And now they must compete to push each other out and to retain dominance. Secondly, we explain that this is likely to lead to majority cultures being dominant and minority cultures being squeezed out at the edges, because Chinese restaurants will not be patronized by people who are not Chinese, because art that is created by indigenous groups will not be bought by people who are not indigenous. Those markets were insufficient to sustain those things, so they will start to cease to exist. We explain it means you feel the need to defend the purity of your culture and that you get more otherization. All of which led to things like more racialized politics. It led to things like more violence. And we literally have seen this happen recently, right? Like the rioting in KwaZulu-Natal when Jacob Zuma was jailed was a result of people viewing their own tribal and cultural identity as more important than their identity as South Africans. That is exactly the harm that side negative has yet to defend, but must do so. Let's secondly respond to their claim that even in our best conception, there will be no capacity for reconciliation on our side because this can never be done well. We explained to you firstly that their main claim here is just that it always is bad because, for example, it promotes things like the model minority myth for Asians, or it makes you think that black people are thugs because of rap music. Firstly, does this seem like something that is a result of too much cultural appropriation or a result of cultures not knowing each other well enough? Obviously, stereotypes stem from a lack of understanding of different cultures, not too much understanding. It wasn't rap music that made people view African Americans as thugs. It was a pre-existing stereotype, and it was one that was washed away when more white people got into rap music and understood that culture, which is why the people who view African Americans as thugs aren't people who listen to rap music. It's like old fogies who don't listen to rap music and who hate that kind of music and use it as a vehicle to engage in racism that would obviously occur much worse on their side. And that's the important thing to point out now in explanation as to why cultural appropriation will be done well on our side and arrive at a series of benefits. The first thing, and Leah points this out very eloquently, is that racism is the thing that is responsible for the vast majority of their harms, right? Like a lot of their stuff is just that it'll be done badly and you'll like put the other groups down and so on. That's a result of racism that we explain occurs more on the side we do not have the interaction of groups, where groups siloized, where they do not interact. We don't get that harm. But secondly, we explain that this is like a norm that is likely to apply asymmetrically to different groups, right? Like bad actors who just want to make a quick buck or who are fine with exploiting other groups will obviously continue to do so on their world. On our world uniquely, when everyone feels it's okay to go and engage in appropriation, that is where appropriation is led by people who are likely to be very sensitive to the cultures of the groups who do it, because they are generally more enlightened, more educated, and more caring people were likely to do things like try and do so in better ways. And they're likely to be able to constrain the way that that occurs because they can also engage in the activity and outbid those groups and move them out, which is why it's likely to be done relatively well. Let's deal with the sort of 4 reasons they give as to why it will be done poorly. Firstly, they say groups view each other badly, so when the appropriation starts, it will be seen poorly. Firstly, we just point out that historically, even groups that disliked each other were often able to trade ideas and policies and science and all of those things. It's unclear that this is as potent as they claim. But secondly, obviously, this is something that can improve over time. As you begin that sharing, you begin to know each other better, the animus breaks down, and you use commonalities that you can use to build that relationship. Secondly, they say that there's double standards of acceptance, like white people with dreadlocks are okay, but African Americans are not, and that makes you feel really bad about the appropriation. This is correct, but we would point out that 1, this is a product of racism, not the appropriation, and 2, it's something that we can actually challenge on our side, because now African Americans can point out that double standard and say, hey, isn't this unfair? Shouldn't dreadlocks now be seen as professional and acceptable? And that is likely to get far more traction than on their side, where only African Americans have that hairstyle, so it's much harder to fight against the racism that automatically wants to view their culture as something that is bad or unprofessional or dirty and not to be associated with. They say groups will feel like it's stolen, but the comparative, no, like 1, they'll see it's being appreciated, but 2, the comparative is you destroy those artifacts. You attempt to push out that culture. You attempt to convert them to your religion because you're fighting for dominance rather than mixing the cultures together. They lastly say some religions need to be exclusive. I think most people respect that. They don't really give you analysis why the comparative wouldn't be worse when you seek to destroy that. And that means that on our side, we get more things like education, we get more things like people understanding each other. They get things like stolen generation and things like prosecuting people for their hair or appearance. Incredibly proud to affirm.
I thank the speaker for a fine speech, and now to end the constructive section of this debate, may we have the third neg.
Hi, I'm going to assume I'm audible and visible.
Yep, you are.
Great. Start in 3, 2, 1. The remedy to decades of brutal ethnic violence is not to allow those groups to tear away at hateful caricatures of each other and dismantle the tokens of each other's spirit. I don't care if appropriation is acceptable in the abstract or colonial appropriation got us better tomatoes. I think the fact that their defense at third is to say the problem, no, it's not inherent to the context, it's just racism. In a context where racism is predominant because you've had history of ethnic tension, it's just the fact that means that their case is down. I want to do 3 things in this speech. First, I want to clarify what the burden on the affirmative team is and what exactly it is they must defend. Next, I want to ask how appropriation will be done. And finally, why this ignites ethnic tension in the vast majority of cases. Let's first ask what the burden on the affirmative team was to defend. Their burden was to defend the widespread and active promotion of a system of cultural appropriation. Importantly, to embrace is similar to the emotion that is this house would celebrate, in that they do not get to pick and choose the instances they choose to embrace and celebrate. The false dichotomy they attempt to sneak in at third aft shows just how far they've fallen from this burden, because they assume that culture warring is exclusive from cultural appropriation, when what we explain down the bench is if there are incentives to culture war, cultural appropriation is the mechanism by which that cultural feuding happens. It's the mechanism by which majority cultures attempt to dominate each other. So clearly the comparative wasn't between a world with culture warring or without culture warring. The incentives remain the same. It's about the mechanisms and avenues that sides and different ethnic ethnic groups have to manifest those incentives. What is the counterfactual then? Two things to note here. First, we're perfectly happy to defend the counterfactual of multiculturalism and cultural separation. They can't say we don't have reasons to this and then proceed to explain why it is likely to happen anyways. If your worst case scenario is an instance of cultural siloism, we say that people are likely to attempt to relate to each other on different grounds of their national identity. They're able to deprioritize that culture insofar as they see it as something they only practice within their ethnic group and not something they can take from others. Importantly, they ignore the entirety of Mikko's speech, which defends even our worst case scenario where these cultures are entirely insulated from each other. But secondly, I want to point out, Udai also appropriates the lazy responses to Vino's case in that debate. It's not just like national lakes and monuments. It's the de-emphasis of culture and the focus on other shared interests, e.g. the creation of state institutions, which allows people to come together, which means there's not an avenue by which this culture warring can happen, and that is where the debate begins. First question, how will this appropriation be done? And I want to note, all of AF's impacts are premised on a very specific envisioning of appropriation that is very neutral, very shallow in the aspects that are taken, and seemingly immune to the context of tension and demonization. Their defense of this is utterly lacking. First, their positive defense isn't actually anything structural. They don't give you any reasons why a cultural appropriation is good. They give you a set of examples and assert it becomes the norm and assert that the problem is racism. Yes, the problem is racism. The problem is that you are in a context where that racism is predominant because there are many cultural misconceptions that are still deeply held, because these groups often see each other in extremely negative ways, which means they aren't going to charitably pick and choose the elements they reproduce. They're going to pick and choose their elements that demonize the other group the most. Secondly, their defense at second is to say that cultural appropriation is worse when it's not embraced by the state. First, it's absolutely unclear why cultural appropriation still happens in a world where it's heavily stigmatized. And take note, by their own logic, this social stigma is enough to guide the type of cultural appropriation that happens. If that stigma is heavier in our world, it's incredibly unlikely that there is any sort of cultural appropriation that is tolerated to begin with. Secondly, who are the good actors that you want to join the cultural appropriation rat race? If anything, your characterization that these people are the most culturally sensitive suggests that these people produce the least, because it's much harder to craft a detailed recreation of what came from that group and take the time to research their norms and beliefs than it is to manufacture the same caricature over and over again, which is why appropriation is so often racist and harmful. But further, their claim that this is a very disorganized process that happens in bits and pieces means even if you wanted to avoid violence and potentially offensive caricatures, there's no ability to control what happens when you put that out into the real world and more people express their views on it. Their final attempt to save this is the Hail Mary assertion at third that the alternative is culture warring. First, as we explained, there's no attempt to gain cultural hegemony over the other insofar as you don't see appropriation as a valid mechanism that you want to come into. Even if you wanted to dominate other cultures, if cultural appropriation is so heavily stigmatized, and as we say, the state highlights how it creates opportunities to return to a time of ethnic violence that all groups want to avoid, it's extremely unlikely that groups are going to turn to this without the go signal from the state. But furthermore, even if you believe that culture warring is the comparative, the problem is that the markets they create enforce dependence from smaller cultures towards bigger cultures, versus in our world where separation ensures you have a greater amount of power against them, because even if they wanted to step over your culture, they require a level of legitimacy from you. And we run this all the way from David. They need to consult you. They need to have local artists be the one producing it. They need to have you involved in the production process, as compared to a world where they can unilaterally produce without indigenous voices. Compare that to the many things that go unresponded to down the bench, and I think we are quite convinced that this appropriation will be terrible. What are the outcomes, secondly, of this appropriation? We say it ignites ethnic tensions in the vast majority of cases. They give you two things as an attempt to response. Their first claim in response is to suggest that this instead generates unity and cultural understanding. But this falls out immediately. Firstly, because they don't show a link between simply seeing someone else wearing a token of your culture and you suddenly having a dialogue of understanding. I'm not clear why just because I see a white woman practicing yoga, I suddenly feel like she understands me and the decades of history that are inherent to my culture. What we demonstrate instead is that there are many ways this interaction can go wrong. There's an extremely high likelihood of misinterpretation because you don't know what the incentives or the intentions of the person wearing your religious symbols is. The view that this is theft because they're the ones producing it, because they're the ones profiting off the ability to manufacture and replicate your cultural systems. The lack of an incentive motive on the part of the appropriating party to further understand and engage in cultural dialogue when they can claim a tokenistic level of legitimacy already because cultural appropriation is legitimized. So in their world, someone replicating this culture in offensive and harmful ways can say, well, they can use the same arguments they say. Well, cultural appropriation isn't inherently bad. I do have a level of understanding of the culture. It's not so bad that I want to neglect them and ignore the people this actually came from. Further, we explain that once a culture is able to appropriate you with legitimacy, they no longer need your backing. They no longer need indigenous artists. They no longer need to understand the culture and the roots of the social problems where rap music came from, for instance. They no longer need the voices of indigenous people to make decisions about their cultural practices because, as you say, it's okay to mix and match, and they think that is a power they can use over you. Alternatively, they say we at least keep the minority culture alive. First, do you keep the minority culture alive? If it is in such a state where it is so appropriated and so bastardized that it's separate and completely distinct from the original culture it came from without any recognition of its roots, I don't understand how valuable this would be to a member of that community where it came from. This is moot at best. But secondly, and importantly, I think AF skews the debate here. It's not as if people don't consume minority culture in our world. It's just that that minority culture is produced by members of that minority. Remember, the nuance of this debate and of appropriation is who is producing the tokens of that culture, not necessarily the people who view it. We suggest that interaction, if you believe it works at creating unity, is far better in our world. AF creates a system that flares up ethnic tensions and allows for hatred to flow. We prevent that by cutting off its pathways. Negate.
All right, thank you for that speech. That also effectively ends the constructive section of this debate. And now for the reply speeches, where the time is halved to 4 minutes. Maybe first have the negating reply speaker.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yep, you're audible.
All right, one moment. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The third affirmative speech assumes that the incentives for domination are exclusive, but as Tobi points out, they are not. It's about how this domination manifests. And note there's very little construction to defend why explicit domination is any better than domination through the lie of acceptance. The first thing I want to point out is the imbalance of power that will exist between the larger culture and the smaller culture. What we explain is that your ability to profit and defend your own culture in the sense that your local producers are still likely to benefit, in the sense that you, as Tobi points out, are not dependent on a massive market that now controls production and distribution. It therefore means you have a greater ability to resist in these instances for these kinds of forms of domination. We don't think that made them any less dominant. Secondly is the legitimacy. What we explained as well is it is so much more popular and easy to sell that I'm just trying to share culture with you, which is why we're taking your land, which is why we're taking your cultural sites, which is why we're taking all of these crucial things that are important to your identity, because I have a right to it just as much as you do. Versus, they never ever explain how popular it would be to just outright invade and violate another culture, or whether or not they would have likely had no resistance or had any kind of popular support. They can't just claim this, they had to build this. Thirdly is the survival of these minority cultures. At best, they explain that the culture will survive. The first thing I want to note is that we point out a third affirmative, that it is just such a different form of culture that one, it's unlikely how meaningful this survival is. But two, as I point out in my speech, the people who wanted to be able to experience a culture that best fit them, their communities and their groups, are unable to do that insofar as they have to access a bastardized and tokenized version of this kind of culture. In these instances, this ability to say that there will be a culture war and they will attempt to dominate obviously is non-exclusive. The only thing that changes is the mechanisms and how it manifests in terms of extent and likelihood that we prove are likely to be far worse, far more likely to be widely accepted as well on our side of the house. But the next thing I want to point out is that was a very generous first half of my reply, because it assumes that unity would have occurred to begin with. We posit three things that make it more unlikely. The first is that they had to compare this and outright prove that there was no chance any alternatives to culture would work. What we explain is that a history before colonialism is what David said, not after, that likely was before these kinds of divisions. shared common goals of economic development or any other thing that might tie these cultures together, or just celebrating the diversity that exists. Secondly, is that we don't think it caused unity to begin with comparatively, not only because it is likely to be incredibly offensive. At best, they just say and assert the third affirmative. No, they're just like it. It's celebrated. That's great. When clearly they say that all the problems root from racism, when they can't just exclude that from the debate insofar as there is intense historical ethnic tensions and therefore are more likely to ensure the ways in which this manifests are likely to be worse. So I don't know why this would have been accepted so favorably by this minority community, especially if they're likely to see this as a theft, likely to see this as an act that is done by the people that have oppressed them for years. It is unclear why that was likely to be good to begin with. But the last thing I want to note is how generous we have been throughout this debate. Insofar as there's a comparative difference in the degree of unity that occurs, we think it is more likely to spiral them back into ethnic tension on their side of the house. But we were the only team in this debate to be able to defend our worst case. In the instance of cultural separation, they say that is bad. There is no understanding. I don't understand why that was any better insofar as their forms of understanding are unlikely to benefit these groups. And that's because they're unable to deal with characterizations we deal with throughout the bench. One, with intense ethnic tension, you're not going to pick any of the difficult parts that would actually cause understanding towards another group. You're likely to pick the most superficial aspects of their cultures that don't make you understand them any better. Secondly, is that without that consent, because of the same power imbalance that they're able to ascribe, it makes it therefore impossible to have actual forms of that culture represented. But the guise that it is represented, the guise that there is now peace between two cultures, is a lie that is going to fuel any kind of effort to try and say that it is okay when really there is not any chance of any kind of reconciliation in the near future. I'm very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for that speech. And now to end this debate in its totality, may we have the affirmative reply speaker.
Can I be heard?
Yep, audible and visible.
Okay. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. The negative case is built on the questionable premise that ethnic groups who hate each other will hate each other less the less they know about each other and the less they are actively encouraged to consume and appropriate the other's culture for their own. It suggests that the less you know about a culture of a people you have to interact with daily, the less likely you are to feel disgusted or irritated by it. And that is the questionable premise that must lose them this round. I'm going to ask one question in its reply because there's really one question that matters. And that question is a model of siloization and separation more likely to lead to racial conflict than a model of appropriation? Obviously, under both sides, these groups are different and distinct and have a history of violent hatred and tension. But as side negative tells you, all of these actors, at least presumably, would want to live in a country without serious racial tension. And they tell you that at first negative. And it's important in this debate because it exposed an important tension in their case, that these groups wanted to get along, but were these groups hated each other, but were so simultaneously so keen to get along that they were willing to tolerate and coexist with other groups, the culture of which they did not understand and were actively discouraged to disregard. And the culture and the interactions with their own culture, they were encouraged to view as potential for theft. And in fact, the only real option they have for these groups to coexist is the unifying factor of maybe some history that you learnt and probably forgot in school, and the fact that you share the same number of lakes and forests. The push from Neg Block that, oh no, you can focus on shared economic development is far too late and is also incredibly vague when you don't have a national identity or culture, these people are just more likely to think only about their own group and their own culture and hate and vilify the other groups in the country that they live in. And the question in this debate is, how can they coexist? And that's why even if we can only provide a thin veil of unity, it is better than their deeply implausible comparative. Because every person under our side who watches Hamilton and believes America to be a place where people of color can belong, or every person who appreciates, and yes, perhaps even appropriates in a cringy fashion, the music or the food of another group, is a side that is more likely on the margins to view that other group as something deserving of respect, or at least something that is interesting to them, and not something that is disgusting. They claim it is harder for these groups to explain past injustice, and therefore, and when there's a narrative of false equality, at no point was our burden to defend a world where people deny that racism exists, but also given this debate occurs in context with serious racial tension, affirmative action or any other similar legislation was not something they can claim. But we go further here, because we say when groups can't mix, there are financial incentives to treat other cultures and forms of cultural expression as something that damages your own, because markets for cultural expression become very zero-sum, right? Because they only appeal to your group, and on the flip side, they only appeal to their group. They say in response that, oh, well, minorities will be angry at majorities and oppressors profit from their culture. And that's really the most consistent line they have. But as ever for side negative in this day, the problem with this argument is one of comparison. The alternative for minorities is not being able to thrive and not one where their culture is celebrated, right? It is not a world where minorities have greater access to legal representation or greater access or forms of protecting their own culture, right? They never explain how that would be the case. Our comparative here is that appropriation offers a way for majorities to come to value and appreciate minorities and the things and the culture that they bring, which is obviously often imperfect and bad, but it is far preferable. That's why when white kids started listening to hip hop at school, it made it easier for black kids to listen to hip hop, and teachers were less likely to get mad because hip hop was seen as something that everyone could access. We gave you three mechanisms. We explained that forms of cultural appropriation were likely to improve over time. They developed empathy, and people could collectively lobby as everyone started to enjoy particular cultural practices, not just a specific minority group, and they had no response. They never explained why racism would go down under their side. We explained that cultural appropriation, although often imperfect and uncomfortable, on net brings people closer, and given that under their side, people are still likely to throw and hurl racial insults at each other, our side is at least the side where there is some form of cultural communication and there is some form of progress, and national unity is not built under the even thinner veil of national landmarks or past history.
I thank the speaker for that speech and to all debaters for that excellent debate. That's it for the grand finals of Nepal Australs. Good luck to both teams. The panel will now retire to the court.